Hello and welcome. I'm Jahnavi and you're watching The Wire Wrap, which is our new weekly show where we discuss recent developments in the run-up to the 2024 Lok Sabha polls. With me today are two very special guests. This is Angshuman Chowdhary. He's an associate fellow at the Center for Policy Research, and Siddharth Varadrarajan, founding editor of The Wire. Now, the first thing that we'll discuss today is the Chandigarh mayoral polls, in which the Supreme Court has developed a verdict on Tuesday. The Supreme Court made a pretty significant decision because it said that the AAP Congress candidate Kuldeep Kumar was in fact to be the mayor of Chandigarh, which is different from what the presiding officer, Anil Masi, had announced on January 20th when he'd declared the election in favour of the BJP candidate by saying that 8 votes cast in favour of Kumar would not be counted, claiming they had been defaced in some way. Now, the Supreme Court has come down quite heavily on Masi, saying that there should be a court-monitored probe, both because they have said that he was the one who, in fact, defaced these ballots, and also that he lied to the court on why he was making these markings. So, Siddharth, I wanted to start with you. Now, Masi's role has also come under question because until very recently, while all of this was happening, he was BJP Chandigarh's minority cell head. So, what does this whole incident say about democracy in India, what he did, and then how the court has reacted?
I think the Chandigarh episode needs to be understood at several levels. First of all, full marks to the Supreme Court for delivering a very clear-headed and direct order. No pussyfooting around the core issue, which was that the first result was obviously rigged. And what's interesting is that the court also was one step ahead of the Bharatiya Janata Party's game plan, which was, as we know, because on the eve of the Supreme Court's verdict, 3 Aam Aadmi Party councillors defected to the BJP and thus gave the BJP a majority.
Yeah, so a fresh election would
exactly. So the court wisely said that, look, what happens in the future happens. But as far as the central issue before it, who won that election, decided to rule on that. So that's a very strong statement that the court made, because even in the first hearing, the Chief Justice said that he would not tolerate horse trading. And so there was, in a way, a reference to some of these games that were afoot. But to understand the true significance of this, I think, and what it means for democracy, as I said, multiple levels. First, how did the governor or the LG select such a person to conduct an election? Right? So the rot begins perhaps at that level, or maybe one step prior to that, because we know in Modi's minimum government, maximum governance, and his very PMO-centric Raj, that decisions by governors, LGs, everybody who is a political appointee is highly centralized. So I refuse to accept that the LG selected somebody like Anil Masi as a presiding officer by happenstance. It was by design. Perhaps he received instructions that you must have a suitable, committed presiding officer. And so this raises questions about the LG's behavior and how he could choose such a person. Then, of course, you have the behavior of the presiding officer himself, manifestly illegal, as the Supreme Court suggested, said actually, and now he will have to sort of face the music on that score. Masi, once he was selected by the LG, why did he do what he did? Did he do it purely out of his own volition? Was there a wider conspiracy? In any democracy worth its salt, there would be a thorough probe. If you can have the police routinely under BJP opening investigations, not just into the Delhi riots, say, but the wider conspiracy. So Umar Khalid, it's not enough that you didn't find much in his speech, but surely he was part of some wider conspiracy, right? So you open this can of worms and say, I'm going to look at the wider conspiracy. Surely Mr. Anil Masi was part of a wider conspiracy. We know that Mr. J.P. Nadda tweeted ecstatically about after the result, hailing this victory. So was J.P. Nadda in on it? Was Mr. Amit Shah in on it? Right? So this needs to be probed. It's not being probed. But I hope the Supreme Court follows through on this. Third, before the Supreme Court got to deliberate on this, the Aam Aadmi Party, the aggrieved mayor-elect or the would-be mayor, went to the High Court. Now, the High Court is empowered under the Constitution. It's a constitutional court. And nothing prevented the High Court from doing exactly what the Supreme Court did, which is to summon the record, examine the ballots, ask Mr. Masih what he was doing, and then pronounce a verdict, right? Why did the High Court wash its hands of this issue? In our sort of system of divisions, the court isn't answerable to anybody. So, this is just a question I can pose. There's no investigation that can be done. But I think somewhere down the line, in terms of judicial discipline and the functioning of the courts, this is a question that we really need to ask. And the final question, if the BJP is determined to win the smallest of elections, which is a mayoral election for a union territory, right? This tells you the extent to which the party is prepared to cross any hurdles, break any rules to win elections. And I think this is a very, very bad indication of the mindset with which the Bharatiya Janata Party is approaching 2024. I think that I'm setting aside questions that are always raised about EVMs, etc. I'm personally agnostic on that. But I think there are plenty of other elements in the election scenario where the playing field is not level. Last week on the show, you discussed electoral bonds. Yes. The BJP has 650 crore war chest, and the Prime Minister, who's kept silent on this, and it was his brainchild. He and Mr. Jaitley, concocted this whole idea of electoral bonds. He has the nerve to make a statement before BJP supporters, cracking a joke about Krishna and Sudama, saying that if Sudama had given puffed rice to Krishna, as the legend goes, and somebody had made a video, then a PIL would be filed on the Supreme Court and Krishna would be found guilty of corruption. So you're basically implying that, your analogy is designed to launch an implicit attack on the Supreme Court's verdict on electoral bonds. So even though the court has given a very clear verdict, you were unhappy, right? So the BJP, I think, I would read the Chandigarh election as a clear sign of the BJP's willingness to pull out all the stops and get victory at any cost. And I would say that the court's intervention tells us that it is still possible, if you have independent constitutional authorities that actually do their job, that the fundamental principles of democracy can be upheld and people's mandate can be respected.
On your last point, the way in which this was done, it was very out in the open. There are videos you can see of this presiding officer marking these ballots. So do you think it has come as a surprise, this last point, that the courts have in fact intervened in this way and then the people's mandate was actually held up?
I started by saying I didn't want to talk about EVMs, but if you had an electronic voting for maybe tampering wouldn't have been possible, or maybe tampering wouldn't have been recorded and detected, right? So I would say that a party which is willing to, in full public glare, do this kind of hanky-panky would also have been tempted to mess around with machines. And the public wouldn't have seen that evidence, the courts wouldn't have seen that evidence, and maybe you'd have had a very different outcome. So I think it's great that this happened in public glare. Even then, I would say there was no shortage of people in the Godi media who tried to pretend as if what we were seeing was something very routine and part of the electoral process. It's only when the Supreme Court actually examined the ballots and Mr. Masih himself confirmed that he marked eight ballot papers, and the court found no other marking on any other ballot sheet, right? So this is an open and shut case, and it wouldn't have been detected if there was electronic voting. So I think somewhere down the line, maybe moving in the direction of transparency, people need to have confidence in a voting system. That confidence has been shaken by what we saw in Chandigarh. And I think that the court is considering a petition filed by a sort of civil society body on free and fair elections. I think one of the prayers that they are making is that apart from the EVM tally, there needs to be a change in the way the VVPAT sheet is printed, and those sheets should come into the hands of the voter, and then she should be able to put that in a box, and both should be counted. So I think that the court maybe needs to look at some of these issues, because Chandigarh is a very bad augury of what may lie ahead.
Thanks. So for our second issue, we're going to zoom out a little bit and Earlier this month, the Indian government has announced that it's suspending the free movement regime that exists with Myanmar, under which people who live in the border areas can cross up to 16 kilometers into the other country without a visa for up to 2 weeks. In addition to that, the Home Minister Amit Shah has said that India plans to fence the entire more than 1600 kilometer border between the northeastern states of India and Myanmar. And both of these moves have been met with some criticism from civil society groups in the northeast and also from two chief ministers from Mizoram and Nagaland. But in Manipur, where we've been seeing ethnic conflict since May last year, the state government, which is led by the BJP and Chief Minister Biren Singh, have in fact been supporting this move. And Biren Singh has said in the past that the violence in the state is because of people he calls infiltrators. So Angshuman, I wanted you to weigh in on this. Could you tell us a little bit about the history of the free movement regime, and also how do you view this decision? And because it appears to be contrary to the Modi government's what it called its Act East policy.
Yeah, so I think the free movement regime, as we know, was bilaterally formalized in 2018 with Myanmar. But it has a much longer history. In fact, it goes back to 1948. When Burma became independent, 1 year after India became independent. So immediately after independence, Burma enacted something called the Burma Passport Rules, which India also did, to decide the norms and rules of entry into Burma. And there was this exceptional clause in the Burma Passport Rules of 1948, which said essentially that people could enter from India. The local tribes who live there could enter into Burma for within a 40-kilometer range, which is longer than the current range we have, which is 16 kilometer, and stay in Burma for 24 hours. That was by the standards of this time when, the whole region was coming out of its colonial sort of policy, sort of colonial framework, and entering into a whole new system of governance. It was quite exceptional because here we see a country which is according an unprecedented level of flexibility along its post-colonial frontier in many ways. So, and what was even more exceptional was right after Burma did that, India also enacted a passport rule which reciprocated that. Although India allowed, the only difference was India allowed those crossing over from Myanmar to stay for 1 day, and Myanmar actually allowed them, the Indians, to cross over and stay for 3 days, 72 hours. So that was the first, first sign of the modern free movement regime that we see today. So that 40-kilometer zone actually existed for the next about 60 years. In 2004, India revised that and said that we want to limit the zone, sort of constrict that visa-free mobility zone and bring it down to 16 kilometer. And that was done to put a check on the fact that the free movement regime was being exploited by insurgent groups to shuttle across the border. So they said, we'll bring it down. But remember that no one made the argument that we should withdraw the free movement regime, even after 60 years of insurgency on both sides of the border. They just said we need to review this. And remember that by that time, it was a merger of two unilateral regimes. There was no bilateral policy. So in 2004, India reduced it to 16 kilometer, but Myanmar didn't do anything. So there was a lack of clarity on what exactly was it. So at that time, India actually forwarded a draft memorandum of understanding to Myanmar to harmonize the regime, but Myanmar was stalling on it. In 2018, finally, both countries agreed to sort of harmonize the regime. It was formalized to 16 kilometers on both sides of the border. And remember, it was the same Narendra Modi government who did that in 2018. And the logic was very, very wise and very context specific, which is that if you read the cabinet note from the Modi government at that time, during the formalization of the FMR in 2018, it said that we needed to enhance connectivity, people-to-people linkages, and bilateral trade. And at that time, there was a lot of talk about Act East policy, of course. Act East policy was launched in 2014, which was an upgrade of the Lok East policy. So the logic was clear. We need to build bridges to Myanmar and onward to Southeast Asia. In fact, Northeast India was pegged within the Act East policy framework as a land bridge to Southeast Asia. So that was a sort of zeitgeist spirit of the time, we need more connections rather than walls. With this decision, it's a reversal, it's a complete sort of 180-degree reversal of the tide of building bridges, of using Northeast India as a bridge or as a springboard to Southeast Asia. and it's a reversal by the same government. We see quite an unfortunate reversal. So I would say it's the government walking back on its own promise of building a seamless west to east linkage from northeast to southeast Asia area, and also in many ways it's a reinforcement of, I would say, colonial cartography. That boundary line that separates India and Myanmar, that 1,643 kilometer border, is a colonial imagination. It's a colonial imagination of space making and control, that both countries realize that we need to proactively probably work around this. And please remember that even the colonial government realized that we cannot build a fence in this border. Because it's so logistically difficult. That border runs through some of the toughest terrains in India, along India's frontiers. Dense forests, very, very dense forests, hills, riverine valleys, you name it. It's just absolutely treacherous and terrifying, that terrain. So it's not logistically possible, and more than that, the colonial government at that time also realized that if we fence this border, we're going to create a kind of discontents within the tribal communities living in that border who share that space. It's a continuous geographic space where so many ethnic communities live. So, and that same spirit, as I said, lingered on after independence, and successive governments in Delhi have also realized that we cannot absolutely do this. We do this and we create new cycles of discontent along our northeastern frontiers that's only going to complicate the already complicated, social contract that exists in Northeast India. So I fear that this decision is going to do something unprecedented in that sense if the government goes ahead and does it, which is fence the border. Let me also say that I think there's a lot of pre-election like saber rattling in this. Yeah. And as you said, it's linked to Manipur. It's not just that the Manipur chief minister has been supporting the decision. He is the one who's been asking for the border to be fenced for a long time now. He asked for it several times in 2020, 2021, which is way before this conflict started, and of course after this conflict started. And the only stretch of the border which is so far fenced is actually a small 10-kilometer stretch in Manipur around Moreh, and that was actually sanctioned in 2003. So and the work started in successive years. So only that border is stretched. So my best guess is if the border fencing plan goes ahead, it'll just be along a particular stretch of the Manipur-Myanmar border, not beyond that.
So that I wanted to ask you how you look at this also, especially given what Angshuman said, like is this an election thing you say and then maybe don't act on because of how it's going to be very difficult, and also it's going to create so much consternation, and how do you view this in the context of Manipur and otherwise?
I think it's more sinister than just a pre-election gambit, because the demand for fencing, and I think Angshuman is quite right about its implications on the bilateral, India-Myanmar front and the wider sort of Indian multilateral approach towards Southeast Asia, right? It's a disaster. But from the domestic point of view, this is highly dangerous because it is designed to essentially give heft to the spurious argument of people like Biren Singh and the BJP in general, and of course Methi, shall we say, extremists in Manipur, that the problem which Manipur is going through right now, ethnic violence if you want to call it, ethnic cleansing, whatever name you want to give, a civil war, is because of what they call infiltration from of Kuki Zos from Myanmar. And I think here getting our terminology correct is very, very important, right? You could argue, and you should argue, that an insurgent, if he crosses or she crosses the border, is an infiltrator, right? Infiltration in the English language would refer to somebody coming in with a nefarious purpose of subversion. And sure, you can describe the Indian insurgent groups operating in Myanmar, sending fighters across as an act of infiltration. But when refugees who are fleeing the sort of instability and martial law, military rule in Myanmar, enter, say, Mizoram or enter Manipur, and far more numbers have entered Mizoram than have entered Manipur, you can't call refugees infiltrators. If you have economic migrants, you can't call them infiltrators. Unless you're prepared to call the Gujaratis who are leaving Gujarat and crossing the Canada-US border or the Mexico-US border as infiltrators, which we certainly are not. And then you have family connections, which, offense of this kind is going to just, and placing restrictions on movement. Because let's say fencing is an impossibility. But if you're going to criminalize the movement of family members, which people have taken for granted for the past 6 decades and even earlier, then this is a serious problem. This is a deliberate attempt to escalate rather than settle the sense of division, polarization, and alienation which is there in Manipur. And I would say that for a prime minister who has yet to visit the state, right, he has time to go to every temple all over the country and abroad. He has time to inaugurate 1,001 projects in Gujarat and UP and throughout the country, but he does not have time to take direct charge and just to see for himself what's happening in Manipur. And now you have this completely harebrained and dangerous idea of fencing. I would say, fencing, like even on the India-Bangladesh border, it's an absurdity, right? I know they're doing it, and they've done most of it, in fact, but it hasn't stopped cattle smuggling. It hasn't stopped the movement of people, and it won't. It's a source of corruption. And similarly here, you're tilting at windmills. If the natural order of things, in terms of local geography and the sort of ethnicities, shared ethnicities, that's as long as that doesn't change, and it can't, you will have the movement of people, cross-border movement of people, right? So you either facilitate it, regulate it, design rules so that it's done in a harmonious way, or you criminalize. And I think choosing the latter route is a very, very wrong thing for this government to do, especially in the context of the ethnic distrust. Already, people in Manipur despair about the state ever going back to the status quo ante of a year ago. With these kinds of proposals being actively pushed by Biren Singh and the BJP, I think that this shows the mindset of actually wanting to aggravate and widen the conflict. And I think that they're playing with fire, because Manipur is a very important border state. Mizoram is going to be affected by this sort of thing, Nagaland too. And to play party politics in this fashion, or to pursue sort of a warped sense of I know that you have Hindutva elements that are involved here, to pursue these kinds of agendas in India's borderlands, which have remained unsettled in a way for the last 7 decades, right? It's just playing with fire. And I think that leaving aside what could be possible if you had more enlightened policy, beginning with Narasimha Rao, perhaps even earlier, and then in the early years of Mr. Modi, there was all this heady talk of developing links with Myanmar and Southeast Asia. Of course, Myanmar's internal political situation has made things very difficult, right? So it's not even with the best of intentions, extending border connectivity and developing all of the India-Myanmar linkages that one had envisaged wouldn't be easy. But what we are doing now is, on the one hand, you have close relations with the military. So it's not as if you are pursuing a policy of not engaging or not dealing with the military. You're doing that. And yet you are putting a stop to any kind of linkages with whether trade, commerce, transport, or movement of people. I think it's very unfortunate.
Yeah. Angshuman, this is something you've written about as well, the Indian government's sort of ongoing relationship with the military government in Myanmar. So given that, and you've said that this closeness exists, this outward respect exists. So given that, how do you view that relationship and why it's continued in this way? And given that, how do you see these plans?
Yeah, I think, as Siddharth said, it's just going to make matters worse on that front, because to be honest, Delhi's relationship with the junta, which is the only side it's formally engaging with today in Myanmar, hasn't really made the pro-democracy forces very happy. In fact, whatever sort of leverage or public diplomacy image that India had managed to gain over the last 10 decades through its engagements in Myanmar, be it through projects like what it calls people-centric projects, like vocational training centers, building health clinics, schools, including in the border areas. That did some sort of that did help India build up its image as a constructive partner to the people of Myanmar in the last 10 years. The coup has changed that. Now more and more people from Myanmar that I talk to, they see India as an adverse, even hostile player. Because India is engaging with the junta, and the junta is unpopular in Myanmar in a way that it has never been before. On top of that, you fencing the border and revoking this free visa-free mobility regime sends an even worse signal to the pro-democracy side, and particularly the groups based along the border, because it allowed many of the communities who are affected by the conflict along the border regions, such as those who are facing brutal airstrikes, artillery bombings, and widespread arson attacks by the Myanmar military, to flee and seek shelter across the border, mostly in Mizoram, but to a lesser extent in Manipur. Fencing the border and criminalizing movement would completely stop that. So it would make a situation that's already dire for India even worse. So that's one thing.
Yeah, and if I can just add, the context. The ICJ is actively considering the sort of case brought by Gambia of the Myanmar regime committing genocide, right? And of course, Rohingyas are the target, but the kind of violence which the Myanmar military has unleashed is claiming all kinds of victims. So to have this idea of a closed border at a time when people are facing manifest distress is horrible. Now, of course, you have any number of people who say, well, Hindustan, sari dunya ka dharmshala nahi ban sakta, we can't open our, so no one is saying that you should absorb millions of refugees forever, and frankly, I don't think that the Rohingyas who've come or the others who are coming necessarily want to settle down and take up Indian citizenship and be, that's not the case, right? So you need to have a policy in place for processing refugees, so rather than sort of calling everybody who comes across the border an infiltrator and then applying your Foreigners Act or Passport Act or whatever to somehow criminalize these guys and look to deport them. And there have been cases of active deportation of Rohingyas despite the fact that they're facing a genocidal situation, which completely violates the fundamental precepts of international law, refugee law, for example. So rather than burying our heads in the sand and saying that no, these guys are all infiltrators, have a rational policy, have a refugee policy, issue documents, process them, and allow them to get on with their lives in whatever limited way possible, and then actively contribute towards finding a solution whereby people can return home, right? So that's what a responsible country like India ought to be doing, right? Especially one that aspires to be a permanent member of the Security Council and that believes it's indispensable when it comes to sort of peace and security in the Asian or Indo-Pacific region. That's how India ought to behave. Instead, you have this situation where you are dealing with the military, you're ignoring the fact that there's a genocidal situation on your doorstep, you're criminalizing everybody who's come in, whether they're Rohingyas or Kukizos or whoever crosses the border for reasons of fearing, having a well-founded fear of persecution. And you literally created a situation which runs completely counter to India's enlightened national interest.
The question you raised on who the state decides to criminalize and treat as criminals actually brings us to our third topic. The farmers who've been protesting for the last 10 days or so have yesterday decided to suspend for 2 days their protest because of the tragic death of a young farmer at the border between Punjab and Haryana. Shubkaran Singh was 22 years old. The doctors who saw him initially say they may have been bullet injuries. He died when the clashes erupted after the police have been refusing to let farmers cross the border to move through Haryana and then eventually to Delhi's Ramlila Maidan, where they have planned to protest. This Delhi Chalo call has now been going on for around 10 days and they've just been stopped at these different border points, and border points that are much further back than where they were stopped even in 2020, 2021. This time it's not even into Haryana. The Haryana police has not officially made any statements, but even the Punjab police have said that this young farmer was probably injured in rubber bullet firing by the Haryana security. he passed away, but more than 100 other farmers have been injured during this time. An autopsy is awaited for more concrete evidence on what happened. But his family, who've spoken to The Wire, have held the Haryana security forces responsible for his death. And now the farmers who have been protesting have had several rounds of talks with union ministers, including the agriculture minister. They have several demands. One of the major bones of contention has become a law for minimum support prices for a larger number of crops, and a nationwide law guaranteeing them. They have said that the kinds of promises the centre has made to them in the past have not been carried through, and even now they are not happy with what is being offered. So I think there are at least two issues that we need to talk about. One is, of course, the demands and what the union government's responsibility is in providing this sort of minimum price support to farmers, given the kinds of environment they're functioning in. And the second is about the right to peaceful protest and what it means for them to face this sort of repressive action from the police, where they're not even being allowed to reach close to their site of protest, and being met with tear gas, with rubber bullets. At least some claim they have seen pellet guns, though the police has said they're not using them. So Siddharth, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think if we were to set aside the first sort of set of questions of MSP related, except that I would say that insofar as the government made a promise, it's perfectly legitimate for farmers to expect that the government come good on that promise, and without inordinately stretching this whole process through. And if there's good faith on the government side, it shouldn't be difficult to find a solution, right? But the second question that you're raising is something which should deeply concern us, because it also ties in with the other topics that we've been discussing today, right? Including the Chandigarh election and so on, which is that does the Modi government, does the Bharatiya Janata Party government in Haryana respect the constitution and the rights that the constitution gives the people of India or not? Because you cannot have a situation where freedom of assembly, which is guaranteed in the constitution, the right to protest, is curtailed in this fashion. So I don't know under what basis or what law, what rule the government thinks that it can block highways and stop farmers from coming to Delhi and making their case. You can designate an area, you don't want them sort of spilling over the Central Vista, fine. Governments haven't allowed rallies in the boat club for maybe 30 years now, after in fact farmers came in the 80s. But you can create designated areas in the capital where farmers can come and present their point of view. To put us, to try to ban their free movement shows the kind of anti-democratic mindset of this government, which is compounded then by sort of unleashing brute force. If you saw some of the videos of the Shambhu border, it looked like a scene out of some kind of civil war, like a military front line where tear gas shells are being dropped from the air, and you have smoke and people running helter skelter. This is not something that is a very good look for a country that claims to be the mother of democracy, quite frankly. And allied to this or connected to this is the government's censorship of social media postings. So it's bad enough that you are physically preventing farmers from coming to Delhi or even coming to Haryana, right? You're not even allowing them to say what they want, lay out their issues before the wider public through the media, right? So you are blocking freedom of assembly and the right to move. You're blocking freedom of speech. You're blocking freedom of press. We've seen examples of all kinds of social media posts and handles being blocked. And I went through some of these yesterday, and I made it a point to tweet to the IT ministers, attaching samples of tweets that have been blocked in India, and asking them on what earthly reason do you have under the IT Act to withhold this kind of a tweet? Innocuous tweets talking about injustice done to farmers, talking about the importance of MSP. How this is completely illegal activity on the part of the government.
Yeah, in fact, even X has released a statement saying that while it's complying with these government orders for legal reasons, it doesn't agree with what the government is doing, and it would in fact like to make these notices public because it thinks that as a transparent entity, people should know why this is happening. Which X in its current form, I don't know if many people would have even expected that.
Yeah. I mean, so it tells you. I mean, as they say in Hindi, ki pani sar se upar chala gaya hai. I mean, the level of the government's demands now has gone so far that Twitter or X is embarrassed by this, right? And so they made a public statement. And fortunately, some of the people who get informed by X have gone public, as is their right. And we've got to see examples of these tweets to see how ridiculous this is. I mean, in one case, there's this guy Angad Singh in a Vice journalist. So he had a tweet simply retweeting what Rihanna, the pop star, had tweeted in 2021, and saying it's time to look at this tweet again, right? And under the IT Act, that tweet was withheld. You know, how absurd can you get, right? So I think that the manner in which the government has reacted and the level of repression that it's unleashed is again something very, very ominous for Indian democracy. And we would be making a grave mistake if we were to think that these tactics and tools and weapons, like the internet ban, for example, in Haryana, so many districts of Haryana, that the farmers are going to be the only targets for this. These are all methods of repression, in a way first introduced and tested in Jammu Kashmir, pellet guns, rubber bullets, etc., now being used in other parts of the country in the face of democratic protest, and the blocking of accounts, blocking of tweets. In the case of Caravan, of course, not connected to the farmers' protest, but the way in which a magazine article on the torture of civilians by the army in Poonch, in Jammu Kashmir, an article which is published in the magazine and which the government has no authority to ban, right, in its printed form. But they are invoking the IT Act and rules to ban its online version. I mean, how is this possible? How is this permissible? And somewhere down the line, the Chief Justice, who put his foot down in the face of a manifest illegality in Chandigarh, needs to take urgent notice of this. It's not as if cases haven't been filed. Twitter itself refers to the fact that it's filed a petition about the government's overreach, and this matter is dragging on and on. And when you can see examples of how the government is abusing its authority, I mean, I would hold that the IT Act and the IT rules, insofar as it gives the government the right to censor stuff, is ultra vires of the Constitution. It violates the Constitution. But even if you don't accept that argument, going by the letter of the law, going by the letter of the rules, there's no way that these tweets which the government is blocking can fall within the ambit of impermissible speech. Yet the government is doing it, and it's as if people have no recourse.
Yeah. Angshuman, I wanted you to speak to this as well, both the physical repression that we're seeing and how this fits into as Siddharth mentioned, a sort of broader atmosphere in which all sorts of speech action are being clamped down on.
Yeah, there is definitely a broader pattern. We saw this in Manipur, where internet was shut down for more than 100 days. So the reflexive reaction to any kind of protest seems to be a shutdown of the virtual space. And it's basically a virtual equivalent of the crackdown that we are seeing, the physical crackdown that we are seeing in real life in the physical space. And one unique thing that I'm seeing this time with respect to the farmer protest is the preemptive security infrastructure that they have created in Delhi. Farmers are hundreds of kilometers away from Delhi. They're not anywhere close to Delhi right now. But we see barriers being erected, and at places even barriers are erected in a way that the traffic can move, but there's a small choke point that's created, just enough to create a small jam. Because I traverse the Noida-Delhi border every day and see this. I drive through the border every day and I see this. That there's a container that's kept right on the edge of the road, some barriers. So there's no full traffic jam, but there's just a slight hint of a jam, right? So it seems that there's an attempt to create this rift between the urban middle class and the farmers by creating this just marginal inconvenience, right? And of course, I think that's unsurprising given that elections are coming up. And also, I think last time the Modi government was forced to walk back on the farm laws, right? So I think it draws the line this time. That, and also the farmers' protest got a lot of international traction, right? Last time, I mean, Rihanna tweeted about it, right? This was unprecedented. But I think the statement that X gave today, I think Global Government Affairs Division or something like that, is also quite unprecedented. I mean, unprecedented in terms of Elon Musk's X, right? So usually X doesn't comment on such things, especially on India. Coming out and giving a fairly long statement on how they're unhappy with this, they're forced to comply because of legal reasons, but they're not happy with this, shows the extent of virtual shutdown. And accounts like Sandeep Singh and all, they were instantly shut down in 2 days after the farmers' protest started. And as Siddharth says, pretty innocuous posts. So it's quite extraordinary, the shutdown that we are seeing on the virtual space. We didn't even see that during the NTCA protest. This quantitative extent of shutdown. So,
But essentially, what's going to happen though, if the government is allowed to get away with this, right? And so we've seen X make some noise, but I haven't seen any angry discussions on TV channels. Maybe ours is the first angry discussion or semi-angry discussion, right? But your big TV channels are avoiding this, and newspaper editorials, there may be one or two. But I'm saying the fact that the government thinks it can get away with this kind of censorship, and let's call it by its proper name. This is censorship. If you allow it in this case, you will see it being used increasingly whenever people take to the streets. We saw an example from Bihar, I think about a month ago. I think our colleague Ajay Kumar covered this in a story, where there were young women and men who had applied for railway jobs in Patna, and they were protesting peacefully at the fact that the whole process was getting delayed, right? And the backdrop is that you just have massive unemployment in this country. So you had these kids protesting, and you had there was no big TV, no big channels came there, but you had YouTubers who were filming, small channels, Hindi, and you had virtually in real time the Bihar police leaning on YouTube, maybe through the Ministry of IT. I don't know what mechanism they employed, right? But within hours of videos going up of these kids protesting and the police using brute repression against them, you had these videos being taken down, right? So the speed with which the government is able to clamp down on the sort of circulation of information is very, very disturbing. And they're doing it for kids protesting in Patna, they're doing it for farmers in Punjab and Haryana. They will use it increasingly for all manner of expression that they don't like, right? And I think that this is the fundamental principle at stake here. And if you now connect this to the Manipur fencing a border issue, where you are provoking or increasing polarization and division in society, and you look at Chandigarh, where you're prepared to do anything you want, anything you can to win an election at any. So this tells us that what you see is a very clear, well thought out attempt to strangle democracy.
No, absolutely.
Procedural as well as in terms of the sort of rights that go along with democracy.
No, absolutely. And I think there are undertones of this that are visible in so many situations, like the IPS officer in West Bengal, in Sandesh Khali, who a BJP leader, while protesting, referred to as Khalistani. And obviously that links back to farmers who during the last protest and now by right-wing social media accounts and BJP leaders had been referred to as Khalistani elements and, fighting against anti-India forces. The police, even now, you can see referring to them like that in statements. We see that in so many of these situations. But again, thank you. Yes,
just
please,
one
of course.
thing that, because Siddharth talked about the TV channels, right? The framing of the farmers, I mean, this is talked about, but of course, they're framed as lumpens, hooligans, anarchists, Khalistanis at worst. But there's also this some of the more sophisticated ones on TV channels, this attempt to infantilize them, right? That they don't understand their own problems. Again, not going into the MSP debate, I'm not an economist. But there is clearly a sense of volatility in the market against which these guys the farmers want safeguards. But there's an attempt to tell them, that patronize them, that you don't understand the issue better than we do in many ways. So I think that also creates this sense that these are lumpen elements who are just doing whatever they're doing for the sake of creating instability or violence.
Not that there's a real issue at play here. Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you both so much for joining us. That's all for this week, and please join us again next week on The Wire Wrap.